Out of the Ordinary Insights, brought to you by Investec Specialist Bank.
Welcome back. You're watching Captains of Industry. I'm Godfrey Mutizwa. I'm standing in for Bronwyn Nielsen. Tonight we're speaking to Mark Bradford. He is the chairman of Lang LaSalle Africa, the sub-Saharan part of it. He was careful to emphasize to me. Lang LaSalle is a global company. They are in 63 countries around the world. 47,000 people employed. We're talking about 120 offices. But Africa is just beginning. Let's talk about Africa.
Just beginning, certainly for the Lang LaSalle story. So at the moment we have 3 full-blown offices, one in Morocco, one in Egypt, and of course in South Africa.
So in Sub-Saharan Africa, you're actually in just one place?
Just in South Africa. Look, Lang LaSalle are different from its competitors in that we own all our businesses.
Okay.
So we don't do associations and franchises and that type of thing.
Great.
And in order to open a Lang LaSalle office, it's a fairly serious commitment because we insist on research departments and you know, in order to ensure that it's fully integrated and has the same capability as any of our other offices.
Let's educate our viewers about who Lang LaSalle is.
Lang LaSalle, yeah, it's a company that was actually originally started in the UK in the 1700s. A lot of people would have known
the same name.
Jones Lang Witten in those days, and then it acquired LaSalle in the States, and obviously that's when it became listed. One of the 2 big property services providers across the globe. Very, you know, obviously we have pockets of domination and excellence, and other areas where we're not as strong. Yeah. But like any company, you know, you can't be strong anywhere. Well, the South African and African business reports directly to our EMEA board, which is obviously Europe and the Middle East. Right. Quite interesting because that's a traditional thing. A lot of companies actually lump EMEA together. I, every now and again, wonder whether we shouldn't actually form part of the sort of Asia Pac crew. You know, particularly in South Africa, we're very isolated geographically.
True.
You know, from and if you look at a lot of corporate profiles, this is a real isolation. And obviously, a lot of the African interest and activity is coming from the Asian subcontinent, etc. So
and then you get subsumed into this European, much larger entity.
Yes.
And sometimes you get lost and you lose your identity. I was looking at your products here, and I see it's agency leasing, capital markets, consulting, facilities management, project development services, property management, tenant representation, valuations, hotels. So when you lock that into the African story and what people are saying in Africa, how does LaSalle fit?
We have a very strong global corporate base, and a number of our big corporate clients obviously are in Africa, have been on the continent for quite a while.
What kind of clients are those?
We're talking about everything from the banking to the retail sector, telecommunications, a very, very broad spectrum, manufacturing. And part of their global agreements with us is that we actually provide them with property advisory and other services on a global, or at very worst, a regional basis. Right. So essentially we are not pioneering, we are following them into these markets. Right. Why would they want a global representative as opposed to dealing with a local company? A lot of it has got to do with compliance, and a lot of it has got to do with accountability. So. You know, they do rather like the fact that they can brief a Lang LaSalle colleague, let's say in New York, and have it executed by the same company elsewhere in the
Somebody
globe.
They know.
Exactly. And as I say, there's the accountability and all the other good stuff.
How's business?
Well, business is, I mean, the South African business has been phenomenal. So in the last 2.5 years since we've been Lang LaSalle, we've grown extraordinarily. It really has been fantastic. Last year, our revenue was up 30% on 2011. Obviously, the headcount is growing. The property space is becoming more complex. Corporate occupiers are demanding a lot more. So we're increasing our intellectual capital. We're learning, obviously, as much as we can from our colleagues around the world. Yeah. The Africa space is the interesting space.
What are you doing there? What are you looking for? Are you replicating what you're doing here in South Africa?
You know, I think what you've got to be very careful of, particularly with these big global corporates, is they tend to have a template which has been developed elsewhere in the world, and they feel they can take this template and impose it on Africa, and they're quite shocked.
It's cheaper.
Yeah, but it's because that's the way they do things, and they're normally quite shocked when they realize that Africa's not interested in their template. Things work in Africa. We just maybe have a slightly different approach and a different way to doing things.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I think to take the sort of Jones Lang LaSalle template and try and impose it on any country is not clever. So it's really a matter of adapting it, a little bit of generic growth.
Yeah.
The big thing with Africa is education, not educating the world about Africa.
Right.
Unfortunately, we have this this media view of Africa. So every time there's a disaster...
Did you say media?
Media, yeah, I wasn't going to mention that. But yeah, every time there's a
There's
disaster
a view that's
somewhere...
been created by the media.
Exactly, and every time something happens in one corner of the continent, the whole continent gets branded with that image.
Yeah.
And I think Brand Africa has done a brilliant job in terms of exposing people to its potential, its opportunity, its future, etc. But maybe a little bit more work needs to be done on the fact that we're dealing with 54 countries.
Yeah. Yeah.
Connectivity between the countries is difficult. It's not easy. So anybody sitting and thinking that the European Union is a nightmare, you know, this could be their alternative. And I think there are pockets of excellence and pockets which have got to take a couple of years before they become interesting.
What are you looking at in the continent? Where are you seeing opportunity? When people talk about Africa, they talk Nigeria, they talk Kenya, they talk Ghana, particularly these days. Now we're hearing Mozambique, now we're hearing Zambia, now we're hearing Tanzania. I mean, we can't keep talking.
All right. I'm in the property space, so I've really had to look at 4 markets. Predominantly, as I say, driven by our clients' demand for those markets. So you've mentioned exactly Ghana, Nigeria, Kenya, Angola is our 4th. Okay, which is very interesting.
It's interesting, particularly Angola, but gone.
Yeah, well, it is. Now, what we need to do is we need to start creating a property market. It doesn't exist. South Africa is definitely part of the continent, but it's separate. You can't look at it in the same light. So in most of the countries in Africa, great GDP growth, fantastic. A lot of it's still driven by minerals. Okay, there is a wonderful African insistence now that we're no longer here to be plundered for our raw materials and labor, but that we're going to start getting involved in the manufacturing sector, not only for export, but for our own consumer demand, which is growing so nicely. And the service and secondary industries, banking, telecommunications, etc. All of these people need to be housed in buildings.
Which is where you come in.
Which is where we come in. Now, in all emerging markets, it's exactly the same when we first went into China and India and those sort of things. International corporates generally start off in working out of small offices in residential areas. They then gather their market. The business starts growing. So you're starting to see office towers developing in actually throughout the continent. You are starting to see warehousing and logistics plants developing. And then, of course, there's the probably more well-known retail development. South African retailers thundering up there, getting into shopping malls, exactly, being highly successful. That's all fair and good, but in order to create a property market, you need people to start investing in property as an asset class, and that hasn't happened yet. So a lot of the global corporates will actually end up owning their own buildings. All right. The cost of capital generally on the continent is horrendously high. We're looking at 20+%. Very difficult to make anything work there. They don't really know, there's no real market in terms of investors, so they end up by default having to own their own real estate. They would very much like to get that off balance sheet. But to whom?
So how do you create that market?
All right. Well,
what's required?
Really, a lot of cooperation between local governments and advisory and experience, basically. So, majority of the continent, for argument's sake, you would own property via leasehold as opposed to freehold. It's not a problem. People have got to know that. Next thing is we need to start developing transparency within the property framework in these countries. We do, every second year, we do a global transparency index. around the world. And we have a look at things like, is land title guaranteed for owners? Is there freely available information in terms of where market-related rentals are? Do tenants have rights, and are those rights upholdable? Can you uphold them in terms of a legislative framework, etc.? And
the legal system, essentially.
Exactly. And on the whole of Africa, South Africa is the only country which we rate as transparent.
Right.
The rest of Africa has various levels of opaqueness, but it doesn't look that different to Eastern Europe or to certain parts of the Asian continent.
Good to know.
It's
Good
not
to
a
know.
disaster. We're not far behind. But what is very important is certainty. So if you're going to try and attract property investors to invest in any country or any environment, they've got to know that there's certainty, that their investment is solid, that their rights will be upheld by law. And if they won't, the investors need to know that so that they can assess their risk themselves. The big challenge, I mean, it's a lot easier when our corporates say to us, we need a facility, source the land, you know, put us in touch with developers, etc. Let's build it, we'll own it. That's the easy part. The emergence of the African property market is when we start to create these markets where there is demand from investors for product, and when the product actually starts trading. And that is about to start now. That's exciting.
We're running out of time. I want to know the type of customer that you're following into Africa. The type of companies that are going into Africa who are looking for your services.
I don't think it would be appropriate to mention names, to be honest, but I mean, I'll give you an idea for argument's sake. We're dealing with a global bank.
So it is the banks.
Yeah, but we're dealing in fact, I've got a number of staff that are seconded permanently to that bank to help them with their African rollout. They're rolling out about 60 new projects on the continent. In fact, 10% of this bank's global revenue comes from Africa. So we're dealing with the banks, we're dealing with the telecommunications companies. Manufacturing, big, really, really big. We've just finished advising on a big project up in Nigeria. That same company are doing another one in South Africa. Logistics is going to be a massive market. And retail, but we're not dealing with the South African retailers. Our focus is on the global retailers who want to enter the continent directly.
You have a minute to give me and sum up for me how big that Africa opportunity is. We were talking about earlier about global GDP and size relative to Africa. For your company, how big would that be?
African GDP is 3% of global GDP. That's its contribution. For Jones Lang LaSalle, between our 3 offices in Africa, the revenue is only 1/4% of our global revenue. If we double that, it would be fantastic business for us. That would put us to 1/2. That's the potential and that's the scale, but it's not an easy market. And I think if we're going to advise our clients properly, it's a matter of actually probably doing less and ensuring that whatever we do is a success.